Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context. You know we like to take these deep dives into the congressional record, and today we're zeroing in on a recent session.
We are indeed.
Specifically from April 4th, 2025.
Right.
We want to kind of give you a clear understanding of what went down, what they talked about, what they're proposing, the direction of things, all that good stuff. So if you want a shortcut to understanding what's happening in the Capitol and how it affects you, well, you've come to the right place.
Yeah. If you want to know what's going on in those hallowed halls, this is the place to be. We're looking specifically at the congressional record from that date, and it's a transcript of all the proceedings that happen on the Senate floor, including speeches, debates, votes, all that stuff.
Right.
We really want to try to highlight the core arguments. What are the major points of view? What are some of the really interesting speeches that were given? Are there any moments of bipartisanship, or is it all, partisan bickering? So we're going to sort of take all this information and then connect it to, well, what does it mean for policy? What does it mean for governance? We're also going to look back a little bit at the historical context of some of these issues and then think about, well, where could this be going?
Yeah, I mean, this is the place to be if you want to understand what's happening.
Okay.
And the session, it started, as always, with the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yep.
But the tone was set pretty quickly when, right after that, a Democratic senator basically said that they were going to expose the dark corners, I'm quoting here, expose the dark corners of the Republicans' plan. So pretty fiery rhetoric from the start.
Right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Using that kind of language, dark corners.
Yeah.
Really framing the conversation. And they were concerned about the consequences of this Republican plan for health, for financial security, really for the American dream. And they said, we were here late last night talking about Medicaid, so it sounds like that's going to be a theme for today as well. They said they were going to talk about Republican tax breaks for billionaires, Donald Trump's tariffs, unprecedented corruption and self-dealing, and protecting Social Security from cuts.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot to cover, but right out the gate, they're kind of setting the stage for what's going to be important today. And, talking about those tax breaks and social programs, we saw one Democratic senator actually use a visual aid.
Oh, nice.
A visual aid that said, families lose, billionaires win. And their argument was that basically the Republicans' plan would slash like $2 trillion from programs that families really depend on just to fund these tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans. And their alternative, or their counter argument, was basically that billionaires should pay their fair share.
Right. So sort of redistributing that wealth, they're saying.
Right. Exactly. And, public education, medical research, even the Veterans Health Administration were mentioned as being under threat from these proposed cuts.
Yeah.
And then we got into a little bit of the history of this with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Oh, yeah. That keeps coming up.
Right. Which, the argument is that it only really benefited the top 1%.
Yeah.
And it didn't really deliver on those promises of increased wages or economic growth.
Yeah.
And they even cited a specific statistic, saying that people earning more than $5 million got like a $278,000 tax break.
I mean, that's real money. That's not chump change.
Right, exactly. And then they talked about the potential long-term impact, like what could this do to the national debt?
Yeah.
And they cited figures from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget suggesting that it could increase by like over $4.5 trillion in the next 10 years and $37 trillion over the next 30 years.
I mean, those are astronomical numbers that, affect us all ultimately.
Right. And that's kind of their point, is like, this is going to have long-lasting implications. But, on the other side of the aisle, a Republican senator countered that the 2017 tax cuts, they actually reduced taxes for an overwhelming majority of Americans. and that it was the middle class who saw the biggest proportional benefit, that, the tax code became more progressive because of it. And they specifically mentioned things like the doubling of the standard deduction and the child tax credit.
Right. They're trying to say, look, this actually helps regular people, it helps families, it helps people in the middle.
Right, exactly. And then they went on to discuss this idea, this concept of a current policy baseline, which is basically a way, I guess from what I understand, it's a way that the Republicans can kind of make tax breaks look like they don't cost anything.
Well, it's a way of projecting what's going to happen financially based on the assumption that current laws are going to stay the same, even if they're not actually going to stay the same. So, like those tax cuts from 2017, they're actually set to expire, but if you use this current policy baseline, it kind of makes it look like they're going to just continue forever, so extending them doesn't really cost anything.
Right, so it's kind of a way to make the numbers look a little rosier, I guess, than they would if you look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats called it magic math. Basically, they were like, no, this is not how you do it.
Right. Well, I mean, that's definitely a debate that's not going away anytime soon. Let's move on to another contentious issue. Tariffs. Donald Trump's tariffs, in particular, were they didn't mince words here. They called them dumb and costly, even likened them to a national sales tax.
Oof. Yeah, I mean, tariffs, those are taxes on imported goods. And the argument is that, companies pay those tariffs when they import stuff, but then they pass those costs along to consumers. Right. And that's where you get this kind of like hidden tax that everybody ends up paying. They even said it could cost the average American household something like $4,200 a year.
And they brought up some specific examples to illustrate this.
Yeah.
The National Association of Home Builders saying that it could increase the cost of a new home by $10,000.
Wow.
Which is, that's a lot of money. Especially when you consider the challenges we already have with housing affordability.
I mean, it's going to price more people out of the market.
Exactly. And then, small businesses, they were talking about facing these cost increases, sometimes as much as 45% on imported goods.
It's a big hit. And, it's not just about the price increases. There's also this fear of, like, a tit-for-tat kind of retaliation.
Right.
Like, if we put tariffs on their goods, they're going to put tariffs on our goods.
Right, exactly. And that could lead to a trade war, which is obviously not something that anybody really wants.
It's a lose-lose situation.
Yeah. And specific industries were highlighted as being especially vulnerable. Distilleries, for example, they said could lose up to 20% of their business. And the hospitality industry could lose like 14,000 jobs because people might not travel as much if prices go up.
Yeah, especially international travel. They mentioned Canada specifically, and flight bookings were reportedly down 70%.
Wow. So, real world impacts. And even within the Republican Party, we saw some disagreement. One Republican senator actually called tariffs on Canadian imports economic idiocy.
Okay. Strong words.
Right. And they pointed out that we have tariffs on allies like Japan and South Korea. But, interestingly, they did say that maybe tariffs on certain technologies from China might be necessary for national security reasons.
Yeah.
So, it's not a simple issue. Even within a party, there's different views on this.
It's nuanced, right? You got to look at who you're putting the tariffs on, what goods you're putting them on.
Yeah.
What are the strategic considerations?
Exactly. Now, another big area of focus was Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And there were some pretty bold allegations, including claims that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are trying to rip away Social Security benefits.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement.
Right. And the idea being that they're trying to take that money to fund tax cuts for the wealthy.
Right.
And the potential impact of budget cuts on Medicaid, that was a major point of contention. There were warnings about devastating consequences for millions of Americans, especially seniors and children. And, the concern that rural America could become a healthcare desert if these cuts went through. And one specific policy that was mentioned was the idea of a Medicaid per capita cap policy. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So that would essentially limit the amount of federal money that states get per person on Medicaid. So instead of saying, okay, we'll fund all the people who qualify, they're saying, okay, we'll give you this much money per person, and then you figure it out. So the concern is that states are then going to have to either kick people off Medicaid, or they're going to have to reduce the services that they offer.
Right.
Or they're going to have to pay doctors less. And that's going to make it harder for people to get the care that they need, especially in rural areas where there might not be a lot of options to begin with.
Right, right. And we also heard about the firing of federal workers at agencies like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the Social Security Administration. And there were claims that these were indiscriminate firings and that there were even plans to eliminate thousands more positions at the SSA, which, if you think about it, that could really impact the ability of the SSA to actually deliver benefits to the millions of people who rely on them.
It's about bureaucracy, but it's also about people's lives, right?
Right.
I mean, if you can't get your benefits because the people who process them have been fired, that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And it slows everything down. And to make matters worse, there was a statement that was attributed to the Secretary of Commerce saying that Americans wouldn't even miss a week of Social Security payments.
I mean, can you imagine saying that to somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck, relying on Social Security?
Right.
It just shows a real disconnect from the realities of people's lives.
Exactly. And it was interesting, there was this point that was raised that at least 2/3 of Medicaid enrollees are actually working full-time. So it's not just about people who are unemployed, it's about people who have jobs. But maybe those jobs don't provide adequate health insurance.
Right.
Or maybe they just can't afford it.
It's a safety net, right? It's
Yeah.
there for people who need it, even if they're working.
Exactly. And then there was a concern that was raised that some states might actually just automatically cancel their Medicaid expansion programs if this funding was cut. And that would obviously have huge implications for healthcare coverage across the country.
Yeah, I mean, the Affordable Care Act, it expanded Medicaid in a lot of states.
Right.
And if those expansions were rolled back, millions of people could lose coverage.
Right. That's a huge setback.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the allegations of corruption and self-dealing that were raised during this session. There were some pretty serious accusations, including claims of unprecedented corruption and self-dealing being attributed to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And the argument was that he was using his position to help his billionaire friends profit from the government.
So basically using the government to enrich himself and his friends.
Right.
And they also mention Elon Musk.
Right, yeah. He was brought up as well with accusations that he's leveraging his position for personal gain and influencing government decisions for his own benefit.
Right. So it's about power and how it's being used.
Right. And there were also concerns about the Department of Justice being purged of anyone who wasn't seen as blindly loyal to Donald Trump.
Right. So the idea is that you can't really have a fair justice system if everybody is just doing what the president tells them to do.
Exactly. And then there were accusations that the IRS is being deliberately weakened or gutted, as they put it,
Right.
to benefit wealthy individuals and corporations. So basically the idea is that, if you weaken the IRS, they can't really go after these powerful people who are, potentially not paying their fair share.
Right.
Shifting gears a bit to Veterans Affairs. There was a lot of criticism of the proposed cuts to the VA and the firing of veteran employees. They called it cruel and harmful.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because veterans issues tend to be one of those areas where there's at least some bipartisan support.
Right.
So to see this level of criticism suggests that people are really worried about the impact on veterans' health care.
Exactly. And they introduced a measure called Putting Veterans First,
Okay.
which aims to reverse those firings and provide appeal rights and also protect veterans' data.
I mean, that makes sense. You want to make sure that veterans have access to the care that they need.
Right. And they also raised concerns about, people with bad intentions potentially getting access to veterans' information.
Right. So data security, it's a big issue for everyone, but especially for veterans.
Exactly. National security was another major topic.
Yeah.
They questioned the firing of the FBI leader who was overseeing the investigation into the Abbey Gate bombing in Kabul.
Yeah.
And also the firing of the head of U.S. Cyber Command.
I mean, those are pretty crucial positions.
Right, exactly. So it raises questions about why those people were fired and what the implications are for national security.
Right.
And then there was this report about the sharing of classified information through the Signal app by administration officials, including war plans for strikes on Yemen. And apparently a journalist was accidentally included in those communications, which reportedly caused a lot of alarm and even angered some allies like Israel. And on top of that, there were warnings from the Department of Defense about vulnerabilities in Signal. So, this sounds like a really serious breach of protocol with some potentially significant consequences.
Yeah, if you're sharing classified information on an app that's not secure, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right, exactly. And then the administration's decision to temporarily halt security assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, that was described as a worse decision, and the argument was that it emboldened Russia and China. So a pretty strong condemnation of that move.
Yeah.
And then finally, there was concern about President Trump taking staffing advice from someone described as a known conspiracy theorist. So, I mean, that's obviously concerning because it raises questions about the quality of advice he's getting on national security matters.
Right. If you're getting advice from someone who's not grounded in reality, that could lead to some really bad decisions.
Exactly. Let's go back to this whole budget issue and the national debt. This idea of the current policy baseline versus the current law baseline in these budget calculations. It seems like that's really a fundamental point of disagreement between the two parties.
It is. I mean, it's about how you account for the cost of things.
Right.
And it really affects how those costs are presented and understood. And the Republicans, they prefer that current policy baseline because it makes those tax cuts look less expensive. But the Democrats are saying, no, the current law baseline is more realistic because it takes into account the fact that those tax cuts are actually set to expire.
Right. So it's kind of a shell game in a way, right? It depends on what you're using as your baseline, how you're making your calculations. And, they talked about the long-term consequences of the national debt and compared it to historical instances of economic instability.
Yeah.
So, this is a real concern. Like, what happens if our debt keeps going up?
Right. I mean, eventually it's got to be paid back. And if it gets too big, it can really destabilize the economy.
Right. One Republican senator stated that their budget resolution would aim for a minimum of $2 trillion in spending reductions. So that's a significant number. I mean, that's a lot of cuts that they're talking about.
$2 trillion. It's a big chunk of change.
Right. And, obviously that raises questions about, well, what are they going to cut? Where's that money going to come from?
Right. Exactly.
But then there was the argument made that if they made the 2017 tax cuts permanent, that would actually boost the economy so much that it would generate up to $4 trillion in new tax revenue.
Right. So the idea is that if you cut taxes, people will have more money to spend, businesses will invest more, and the economy will grow, which will lead to more tax revenue.
Right. That's the supply side argument.
Exactly.
But, a senator pointed out that if this budget resolution ends up leading to what's called an unpaid for reconciliation bill.
Yeah, reconciliation bill. That's a special type of legislation that can be used for certain budget-related things, and it only needs a simple majority to pass in the Senate. So it's easier to pass than a regular bill.
Right. So the point being that if they use this process, they could actually end up adding anywhere from $5 to $11 trillion to the national debt.
Right.
So, it really depends on how they do it.
Right.
I mean, there's a huge range of potential outcomes here.
Yeah.
And then in a particularly poignant moment, they mentioned that in 2023, 30,000 people actually died while they were waiting for their Social Security benefit to begin.
Wow.
And they use that as an argument against cutting services at the Social Security Administration.
Right.
Because, it highlights the real human cost of these delays and these backlogs.
Yeah, 30,000 people. That's a lot of people.
It is. It's a tragic number. Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific amendments that were proposed and the votes that were taken during this session. It was a whole bunch of them covering a wide range of topics, limiting the national debt, requiring inflation impact estimates, prohibiting new spending or revenue legislation if they're already over budget, preventing cuts to critical health programs and Medicaid services, even an amendment about presidential pardons.
So a real grab bag of issues.
Right. It really shows you the breadth of what the Senate is dealing with.
Yeah.
And then there were also amendments on things like improving public health through disease prevention, environmental reviews, and permitting processes, protecting federal judges, increasing the minimum wage, bolstering national safety and security, addressing fairness in athletics, even an amendment about maintaining the data collected by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So, really a wide spectrum of concerns.
And those amendments give you a sense of what individual senators are worried about, what they're trying to get done.
Yeah.
Even if they don't all pass, it shows you what's on their minds.
Exactly. And several roll call votes were actually taken on amendments specifically related to Medicaid funding and instructions for the Senate Committee on Agriculture.
Right.
Most of them didn't pass.
So that gives you a concrete idea of where the Senate stands on those specific issues.
Right.
At least at this point in time.
Exactly. Now, they also took time to agree to resolutions honoring the life of former Representative Mia Love and commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act.
Right.
So, those are important moments as well.
Yeah, it's not all just fighting and arguing.
Right.
There are also moments of reflection and commemoration.
Exactly. And finally, there were some appointments made to the Board of Trustees of the Barry Goldwater Scholarship and Excellence in Education Foundation and to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, Reform Commission.
Right.
So those are important positions that need to be filled.
Yeah, the work of government goes on, even amidst all the debate and controversy.
Exactly. So to sum it all up, I mean, this was a session marked by intense debate, deep divisions, a lot of disagreement on fundamental issues facing the country.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, we saw it on taxes, we saw it on tariffs, we saw it on social programs, national security. These are big issues, and there's a lot at stake.
Right. And, the proposed amendments, the votes, it all gives you a snapshot of where things stand politically and how difficult it is to find common ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that there are these very different visions for the future of the country.
Right.
And it's going to be interesting to see how these debates played out in the months and years to come.
Exactly. So, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights, but we encourage you to keep digging. Explore different news sources, different perspectives, stay informed, and most importantly, get involved. Make your voice heard.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is your country.
That's right.
And the decisions that are made in Congress affect all of us.
That's exactly. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.